Hello, Mr. Montalvo here, U.S. History. Today is Unit 3, Lesson 2, Principles of the Constitution, Day 1, where we focus on the powers that are granted within the Constitution. And our objectives for today. So first, we'd like to evaluate how the United States Constitution serves as a foundation of the United States' government and outlines the rights of citizens by analyzing the preamble in particular. In addition to that, we're going to identify the powers that are granted to the federal government and examine the language used to grant those powers to both the federal government and the individual states. This directly leads into our do now, trying to think of the system of federalism. When we discuss the founding documents, when we discuss the transition from the Articles of Confederation into the Constitution, this idea of federalism came about. And if we remember what federalism is, it's the idea that there is a federal government or national government and state governments, separate state governments with various powers. And today we're going to take a look a little bit more in depth than we did already at what those powers are called and how they function. So ideas limiting the rules of power came from the Magna Carta in England. Yes, the colonists had overthrown the British government, but there were certain principles, particularly in the Magna Carta, that were very important. And I'll also be linking a video separately on the Magna Carta to understand what that document is all about. In 1690, John Locke published 2 treatises of government. He stated in his work that all people had natural rights, those of life, liberty, and property. We see that taken a step further, particularly in Thomas Jefferson's writing of the Declaration of Independence, where he calls those natural rights inalienable rights, rights that cannot be taken away, and defines those as life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The preamble of the United States Constitution states the purpose of government based on the belief that all people are sovereign. If we remember, it's that additional idea known as popular sovereignty or rule of the people. If we're trying to locate the preamble of the Constitution, we don't have to look any further, but at the beginning of the document itself. The preamble of the Constitution, it very simply is its introduction, its statement. And the most defining words, we the people. We the people, rule of the people, popular sovereignty. Those Enlightenment ideals that inspired the revolution are still found in this document, are still present in the minds of the architects, the framers, the writers of the Constitution. Also linked to this is an activity to take a look and break apart line by line the article, or rather the preamble, to better understand and kind of summarize and synthesize its meaning in your own words. This is what that activity looks like, and as I had mentioned, it will be linked below. Now, the purposes of the Constitution. 1, to limit the power of government. They didn't want an abuse of power. They didn't want tyranny. Another one, establish legitimacy as a nation. The United States had a problem paying its bills, and that didn't help its ground standing in the international community, especially as such a young nation. So this document had to be strong and had to find a way to fix some of those weaknesses, those failures of the Articles of Confederation. In addition to that, it had to allow for change over time. We'll discuss something called the elasticity or the elastic clause within the Constitution. Now, the framers wanted this document to last. The Articles of Confederation didn't last too long. Many people don't even know that there were a set of Articles of Confederation. So they wanted to make sure that, and they knew that circumstances would change over time. And they wanted the Constitution to be able to adapt to that. In addition to that, it would create appropriate structures of government separating into three powers, another idea that we'll be discussing today. And then to describe and distribute that power, that separation and that creation of three co-equal branches. Co-equal, meaning that they are exactly, they are invested with the exact amount of power. No one branch is more strong than the other. So, in 1748, Montesquieu, Baron de Montesquieu, published The Spirit of Laws. In it, he said that the power of government should be divided among three branches: a legislative branch, an executive branch, and a judicial branch. Now, if you remember our brief discussion on the United States Constitution, and even the Constitution of Virginia, some of the state constitutions already invested in this idea of the separation of powers. And so now we see the states coming together and adopting some of those ideas to the national constitution. Now, this was designed to keep any person or group from gaining too much power, preventing tyranny, that key word again. Now, this idea, known as the separation of powers, he said and government should clearly define those powers so that we can clearly say, okay, this power belongs to that part of government and that power belongs to that one. So there's no overlap within powers. They are defined. They are definite. Now, why was limiting the power of government so important to the framers? If we think about it, they're just coming out of an extremely abusive relationship with the British, a government both between Parliament and King George III, who they believed abused their power. And so they don't want to see a repetition of that. Now, the theory of separation of powers was strongly stated in the Constitution. Leaders were concerned with the federal government becoming too powerful. According to the Constitution, a member of the United States Congress must resign from Congress if elected or appointed to a position in the executive or judicial branch. Now, this might seem obvious, the fact that the president, if the president was a member of Congress and they won the presidency, that of course they would leave their Congress position, but they wanted to make sure that there was no guesswork involved and clearly defined that. Now, an extremely important quote from Baron de Montesquieu, the person whose theory is the separation of powers, has a very interesting quote. The individual can be free only when the power of one governmental branch is balanced by the other two. This summarizes that idea of three. The Constitution called for a Supreme Court. Congress had to organize the federal court system and courts throughout the country. And in 1789, Congress passed the Judiciary Act. It called for the Supreme Court to have one Chief Justice and 5 Associate Justices. We'll see these numbers change throughout time, but this is how the Supreme Court is born. A system of checks and balances made sure that one branch of government did not become too strong or too powerful. Each branch of government has some control over the actions of the other branches. Therefore, those are those checks that we talk about. Each branch controls different areas so that it does not infringe or take advantage of or insert itself into the areas of the other branches. Accumulation of all powers, legislative, executive, and judicial, in the same hands may justly be pronounced the very definition of tyranny. Now, in order to avoid that tyranny, in order to avoid that abuse of power, separation of those powers within different branches of government had to take place. And so the framers decide on an executive branch led by the president with an executive, so the vice president, and then various cabinet departments and independent government agencies with the goal of enforcing laws. The court system with the Supreme Court, the Court of Appeal, and district courts, and their responsibility is to interpret the laws. Congress, the legislative branch, made up of the lower house, the House of Representatives, and the upper house, the Senate. If you remember when we discussed the Constitutional Convention, that being one of the compromises known as the Great Compromise. And their job is to create the laws. Now, if you see in between each one of the branches, those are those checks and balances in place. Now, let's just take a look at one example, the president or the executive branch to Congress. Most people believe the president is the most important person in the government and the executive branch has the most power. That's not true. They're co-equal branches. And here's an example. Now, the president has the right to veto bills or laws. So even though Congress makes the laws, if the executive branch doesn't agree with it, if the president doesn't agree with it, he can or she veto those bills and send them back to Congress. Now, impeachment power. So Congress has the power to impeach the president. And in addition to that, they can override vetoes with a 2/3 vote. So there is a check and there is a balance. If you can check out the graph on the right and underneath us, you can see the other checks and the other balances respectively. Now, the writers of the United States Constitution created a federal form of government, primarily to divide power between different levels of government, with the national government and the United States government. And we also have to understand that we discussed this already, federal supremacy clause. So if there's an issue between the states and the national government wins. Now, the United States 10th Amendment, so the last portion of the Bill of Rights, provides us with a very important understanding of the rights between states and the federal government clearly. The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. Simply, if it's not mentioned in the Constitution, it is default to the people and to the states. Now, the framers of the Constitution were adamant. Were very serious about protecting the rights and the powers of the states. To ensure this, a system of federalism was developed with a set of national powers and a set of state powers, but also more important, a system, or rather a list of shared powers. Now, here are just a few of the examples. Let's hone in on the shared powers. Now, both the national and state governments can collect taxes. Both can establish courts. Both can regulate interstate commerce, so trade between different states. Both can regulate banks. Both can borrow money. Both provide for the general welfare of their people. And both can punish criminals. Now, if you take a look at the national powers versus the state powers, you can see the reasons for it. With, of course, the state powers with more of a focus on local matters, because at that point we were 13 states, now we're 50, more focused on local issues, marriage, local governments, creation and establishment of schools, and then looking at the national government, more national issues, maintaining a military, declaring war. New York cannot declare war on another country if it wanted to, right? That is a national power. The idea of protecting copyrights and patents, that's important as well. The establishment of a postal system. Imagine 50 different postal systems, right? So there are very practical reasons for these separations. And just a definition of terms, right? So we have the federal powers. These are powers given to the national government. Reserved powers, these are ones that are reserved for the states, aka the ones enforced by the 10th Amendment, Article 1. And then concurrent powers, those shared powers by both the national and the state governments. Now here we have a quick assignment. In order to better understand this, taking a look at a comparison between the Articles of Confederation and the United States Constitution, looking at the structures of Congress, of that legislative branch. So that will be linked below. In addition to that, in order to better understand or try to summarize what we've discussed today, try to explain the system of checks and balances. What does that mean? How does it work? And then maybe what are some examples of it today as well. That's all for today's lesson. Thank you so much for your time. Hope to see you soon. Take care.